in studio the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Democratic Party, Kevin Olasanoye. Thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. It's been a tumultuous few days since learning of comments made by President Donald Trump in a meeting pertaining to immigration, from what we're hearing and what we talked about with DC, calling certain areas and countries of the world shitholes. Doesn't want people from shithole countries. Wanted you to come in today because you have a personal perspective on the matter.
I do.
And wanted to just let folks know when you heard those, when this first came out, when you first heard it, what was your visceral reaction?
I have to tell you, it's a mix between not being that surprised and outraged, really, at the same time. Not being surprised because, you know, the president has a pattern of using this type of language. He made his mark politically by attacking President Obama and the birther issue. He called Mexicans rapists. He, referred to Nigerians specifically. It was reported in the New York Times that they wouldn't go back to their huts. Has disparaged Haitians before. This language, he's been constantly using this type of language, so I'm not really that surprised in that sense. But at the same time, I've been trying to fight the impulse to not be outraged at this stuff, because I think the more it goes, the more desensitized we become to this, and potentially even think maybe that it's not that big a deal. But it's outrageous, the idea that a president of the United States would talk about people who are living in this country, who are working hard, who are trying to do the best that they can for their families and their communities. It's just outrageous. It's beneath the office, and we can't get so used to hearing these things that we don't speak out every single time something happens, and so that's why I'm here.
Do you think this further serves to energize the Democratic Party and people who, might not have been politically motivated or active in the realm of what we've seen from the Trump administration? Again, is it just another instance that might drive more people to the polls, more people to get active, and more people to run for office?
God, I hope so. The truth is there are a couple things. The context in which these comments were made is, I think, just as important as the fact that they were made at all, right? We're talking about on the eve of MLK weekend, when Congress is trying to figure out what to do with the Dreamers. We have a president singling out another group of immigrants, and really talking about them in disparaging terms. I mean, there's nothing else to call it. This was blatant, explicit racism, right? And those folks, some of those folks don't have the voice, don't have a bully pulpit, right? They may not actually be able to vote, but I think, those of us who can, we need to speak up about this stuff. And if that translates to more votes and more activism, that's great. Obviously for the Democratic Party, it's obviously great for our country, but I think more fundamentally than that, this is really about just being able to see something and say something, right? We're living in this world, I think, in the aftermath of the Me Too movement and stuff like that, where folks are, I think, just more willing to speak out about something. And it shocks me that even now we are still having a debate about what was actually said, and what word did we actually use, and do we have Republicans who have enough courage to say that they actually heard what they heard, even though they don't want to say it. And even here on the state level, we've got Republicans who are trying to have their cake and eat it too, right? They, on one hand want to praise the president for the tax reform bill, right? And say, that's the reason why National Grid is lowering their proposed rate hike. And then at the same time are unwilling completely to call this what it is and say that there's no room in our country for people to talk like this. It's kind of a surreal place to be in 2018.
And sitting here in 2018, but as your role as director of the party after these comments happened, what was the dialogue? Who called you up? What was the action items when this happened? And you're sort of the quarterback of the party here in the state. Yeah,
so I was really proud to attend a press conference that was called by Bernard Georges at New Bridges for Haitian Success. If you haven't had an opportunity to meet Bernard, He's an Haitian immigrant doing amazing work in his community. They were just as outraged as I was and everybody else was. He was the lead dog and kind of pulling some parties together and having a press conference to say that we're just not going to stand for this type of language. And everywhere I go, everywhere I talk to people, folks are looking to hear their leaders do the same thing. And so we put out a press release on Friday essentially saying, we condemn these comments in the strongest possible terms, and we're asking our Republican colleagues here in the state of Rhode Island to do the same thing. I mean, I think that there is a time for partisanship. There's a time for us to disagree about tax policy or education. I understand that, there are some folks in the Republican Party who think that there's a place for limited government, and we can have those debates, but this is something so much more fundamental than that, right? This is about who we are as a country, who we are as people, and I think all people of goodwill, all decent people in our country can understand that the president's comments were just totally out of bounds. And if Charlie Baker in Massachusetts and Republicans all over the country can call this out, then we should be able to do that here in Rhode Island. So, I'm going to renew my call to have Republicans in the state of Rhode Island speak up about this thing. Don't equivocate. Don't say, well, if he said it, then maybe. Let's just call this what it is. This is racism. There's no place for this in our country. And then we can go back to having the substantive conversations that we need to about the future of the state.
And you talk about moving beyond this and having these conversations and getting back to it. But do people from these countries who heard these comments, do people who are impacted ever get beyond it? Or is this really a defining moment of the Trump administration and the presidency of Donald Trump himself?
I think that certainly I thought that was the case this summer during the Charlottesville scandal, right? We thought this was a time that, America was going to wake up. I felt like kind of the shaking of the cage. And what we found out is that that's not true, that there's still another place to go. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm here, right, is to have this conversation and to shed light on this issue, because we just can't continually be in this perpetual cycle where the president says and does things outrageously, either through Twitter or in meetings or whatever, and we get to a place where we become complacent. We can't just accept that as fact. Growing up, your parents always tell you when you see somebody doing something wrong, you speak up. And it's shocking to me that people are kind of twisting themselves into pretzels to try to defend the indefendable. At some point, you just have to call it what it is. And I invite people who have not had an opportunity to meet Haitian immigrants and African immigrants like I have. Go to Higher Ground International. Sit down with Henrietta Whiteholder and see some of the great work she's doing in the Liberian community with seniors, trying to help those folks get more adjusted and make sure that they have the medical care that they need to, and create a sense of community. Go to Oasis International, where Morris Akinfolarin is doing great work in the Nigerian community, making sure that young people are having the tools to be able to succeed and go to college. I talked about Bernard Georges at New Bridges for Haitian Success. There are a lot of great immigrants who are disparaged by the president's comments, who, notwithstanding the fact that they're outraged, are still going to go every day and try to make their communities better, try to make their families better. I think that that's what we want for this country. We want to be able to say that people come from all over the place, all over the globe, and if they work hard enough and if they dream big enough, that they can do anything they want. And it's just unfortunate. It's just unfortunate that we have an occupant in the White House who doesn't fundamentally understand that.
And you talk about getting back to the politics, and you also talked about not getting a response per se by a number of Republicans in the state. Will this be a campaign issue if people want to say, are you weighing in on the president? And if the lack of response is such that they are complicit with what the president said, is it concerning to you about the makeup of the state as a whole that people, again, don't hold him accountable for what he said?
Yeah, well, I have been saying for about a year that I think that this is the dance that I think a lot of the Republicans are going to have to do, right? Many of them may agree with him on policy. I don't. But along with that, I think they're going to have to make the decision of how closely they tie their hands to the president himself and some of his conduct. And, what you've seen, I think, in Washington, D.C. is there are a lot of Republicans who are just fed up and who've decided they're not in for a fight. And so I think the number is like 24 Republicans now who are either retiring or not running, either in the House or in the Senate. I'm not in the business of giving Republicans advice, but one of the things I would say is I think that there is a safe space for Republicans to be able to advocate for, conservative principles and at the same time be able to distance themselves from some of the outrageous conduct that comes out of the White House. And if they're not willing to do that, then I think that the voters have some choices to make about whether or not those folks share the values of the president when he talks about immigrant communities, when he talks about this whole DACA issue, right? I mean, that was the purpose of this entire meeting, was we were trying to figure out how are we going to make sure that 800,000 kids all over our country who are here through no fault of their own have the ability to stay here in the only country they've ever known.
We're keeping an eye on that down in D.C. right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And speaking of keeping an eye on things, tonight is the State of the State by Governor Gina Raimondo. What are you looking to hear in her speech tonight?
Well, I think that Rhode Island is certainly better off now than it was 3 years ago when she showed up. All the objective indicators suggest that we're heading on the right path. And so, to quote the old political pundit James Carville, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? I think unequivocally the answer is yes.
Well, what about the polling from John Del Vope at Harvard that found that a majority of Rhode Islanders didn't necessarily feel that way?
Well, I think the next question is the most important question, which is, are you going to be better off 4 years from now? And I think the answer that the governor is going to show tonight is unequivocally yes. Look, the truth is that Rhode Islanders have a right to feel a little bit skeptical about where we are. Change and progress it's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. But I think what I can say about the governor is that she understands the challenges that are out there. She's fearless and not unwilling to take on the tough challenges. And I think that she's got a plan to fix it, whether it's UHIP or trying to make sure that there are more jobs or trying to make sure that we have quality health care for folks. These are big challenges, and what I think we need are leaders who are willing to take those challenges head on and who have a good, solid plan for how to get us there. I was talking to a friend of mine on my way over here about the state of Massachusetts. And 25 years ago, Massachusetts was in a very similar position as the state of Rhode Island from a jobs perspective. People were wondering whether people were going to invest in that state anymore, or is that going to be the capital? And at the time, they had no plan. And now, Rhode Islanders are comparing ourselves constantly to our neighbors to the north and to the south. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a credit to the folks in Massachusetts who had a plan, they stuck to that plan, and they just kept hacking away at it. And I think it's very clear to me that this governor has a plan. It's very clear to me that that plan has begun to start to work. We're starting to see the cranes in the sky. We're starting to hear about companies like Johnson & Johnson and GE and all these other folks coming into the state. I think there's a lot to be proud of, but I think understand that there's a lot of work to do. And I think that you're going to hear the governor lay out a plan for how to start to continue to tackle those challenges tonight.
Well, all eyes and ears are on the State House tonight for the State of the State, but wanted to bring you in, Kevin, to again talk about the comments reported from President Donald Trump down in D.C. Kevin Olasanoye, I appreciate your taking the time to come in.
Absolutely.
I'm sure we'll talk with you very soon.
Thanks so
Okay,
much.
I'll let you
Okay.
go around the corner.
See ya.
Don't go anywhere. We're going to be back with our next guest here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center.